Hello, everyone, and welcome to Intimacy with the World podcast. I am Dorita Holm, your host on this show, where we explore what it really means to be human and what really matters to be able to live a meaningful life. So today I am speaking with journalist and author Tim Ecott. He is Anglo-Irish and has lived all over the world, but is currently living close to Oxford in England with his wife and 2 children. So Tim Ecott is a former BBC World Staff correspondent. He has worked widely in Africa and the Indian Ocean. He writes documentaries for radio and for screen, and has written several non-fiction books, drawing heavily on his fondness for the natural world. So his books include the bestseller Neutral Buoyancy and Vanilla: Travels in Search of the Luscious or Lucius. I don't know how you say that. It's a book
Luscious.
about luscious. Yeah, I thought so. It's a book about vanilla and more books. But his latest book is called The Land of Maybe: A Faroe Islands Year. And the foundations for our conversation today will be in this book. But you never know where we might roam, as I have seen that Tim and I have quite a few things in common. We both studied social anthropology. We have both spent some time in the so-called Paradise Islands in the Pacific and the Indian Ocean. And we have both spent time diving underwater in many places in the world. And last but not least, we both have a passion for the natural world and for the Faroe Islands. So welcome to the show, Tim. I am so excited to be speaking with you after reading your book, The Land of Maybe, which is a beautifully written and really heartfelt testimony to the unique way of life in those wild, steep, and windswept islands in the middle of the North Atlantic. Do you have the book there?
I do, yes. It's never far away from me, but thank you, Dorita. Thank you very much for talking to me anyway. But yes, there's the book, The Land of Maybe, and you will, of course, know that the cover art represents some Faroese men going down the high cliffs of the island of Mykonos to catch gannets, the seabirds, which of course used to be a big tradition in Faroe Islands. It's now only done once or twice a year because there are fewer men living on the islands actually, and not so many people eat in the traditional way, I suppose. But it's the island has now so few people on it that they have to gather people from outside, usually with a family connection to Mykonos, to come and help them catch the birds. And it's a very typically, I think, Faroese custom and a way of interacting with the natural world.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is one of the things I wanted to ask you about, because in your book, you have very detailed and beautifully evoking descriptions of weather, of flowers, moss, the sea, the cliffs, the birds, and any other animals in the Faroes. And these descriptions are often even more rich, I would say, than your descriptions of the humans, although they are rich too. So I am curious, this deep interest in the natural world, where does it come from, and what does the natural world bring forth in you? What does it give you? I mean, I can feel it in the book that you're deeply connected to the natural world.
Yes, I suppose I think it's the thing which matters most to us. I'm always completely mystified by people who are not interested in the natural world. I don't know how they function. And of course, we're living at a time when many people are questioning whether that connection has been lost so widely across the globe that it's causing a lot of the problems, not just the current pandemic, but of course a lot of social problems and a lot of the death of the natural world in a sense is caused by ignorance. And I think a lot of that is that lack of connection, because so many people live in a very urbanized way and they don't realize how fundamentally dependent we are on the natural world. For me, I was very lucky in a sense that my father was in the army and we traveled a lot. So as a young boy, particularly, I spent 4 years in Malaysia. And I suppose it was a very formative time. It was when I was about 7 to about 10 and a half. And I was outside a lot. I learned to swim. We went to islands. I saw turtles for the first time. I saw fruit bats. I saw a bear once in the jungle. There were monkeys in the trees outside our house, and at night I would, hear them whooping. And of course, I used to collect things like scorpions in a jar and giant frogs and things like that, things that any, I think, little boy would find fascinating. And I suppose my parents recognized that, and we always had lots of dogs and cats and other animals. And that was just a big part of my life. And I think my parents would always give me a book about animals at Christmas or for my birthday. And I gradually, built up knowledge to go with the interest. And that's something that stayed with me all of my life. And certainly it was why I became fascinated with tropical islands, because they reminded me of Malaysia. I like that steamy, humid atmosphere with lots of insects and very exotic animals for somebody from a northern hemisphere island, which is Northern Ireland, where I grew up. So I just, looking at things in nature has just always been there for me.
Yeah. At some point in the beginning of the book, you tell us that you dreamt of going to live on some islands, and subsequently you chose the Seychelles in the Indian Ocean to live with your family. And the islands in the Indian Ocean, I've been only to the Maldives, but these are islands that most people would agree are paradise islands. But after some time there, you say that it really wasn't for you, that it was a restless place, you say. So Tim, I want to know, how can you not thrive on a beautiful paradise island with sandy beaches, turquoise seas, warm weather, and lighthearted people? Or maybe not, I don't know.
Well, I've thought about this a lot, and actually for many years I was obsessed with the Indian Ocean. I was very lucky that my job at the BBC allowed me to go there fairly often, mainly to report on politics, but of course I took a great pleasure in being there because it was what awakened my interest in scuba diving. And of course, the islands are different to the Maldives. The Maldives, as you know, they're very flat coral islands, and the marine life is spectacular. But the Seychelles and Madagascar and the Comoro Islands, they have mountains, even volcanoes. So it's a very varied landscape with a lot of vegetation and interesting granite formations. And on Reunion and then the Comores, they have active volcanoes. So it's very, very varied. And I just became obsessed on a professional level with the politics of that region, because it was at the height of the Cold War. And they were actually a very sensitive area where a lot of Western and even other superpowers were very interested in controlling that part of the world. So as a journalist, it was very interesting. And I loved Seychelles particularly, and I spent several years hatching a plan to go and live there, which eventually came off. It was when my daughter was a baby. And just living on a small island with a young child, you think, yes, it's paradise. But actually with a baby, you can't go out in the middle of for most of the day because it's too hot.
Yeah.
You can't walk because it's too hot and too humid. We lived on the side of a mountain. There was no pavement beside the road, so even walking wasn't very safe. So we spent a lot of time at the beach. I personally don't like the beach. I find it very boring. For me, the beach is a way of getting into the sea. But it was just, I think it was something to do with my age. I think when you're younger and, your blood is hotter, you like the tropical places perhaps. And I certainly still have an affection for Seychelles and the general Indian Ocean region. But I'm less compelled to go there. And certainly in the last 10 years or so, I have been lucky enough to spend a lot of time in your islands, the Faroe Islands, and also to go to places like Iceland. And there is something about those northern latitudes which are totally different, of course, to the tropics, but they have their very own distinctive culture. But for the Faroe Islands, for me, at first, it was the landscape, it was the seabirds, it was the notion that there were very few people around, so you could be out in nature without crowds. That's a very special experience. And I love that, and I love walking. But after 3 or 4 visits, it was actually the Faroese people that have fascinated me. And I learned something I've been very ignorant of, probably like so many people, about the very long and very interesting history of the islands and how people have survived there for so long. Of course, it's a very modern, sophisticated country now. but there seems to be a connection there between the people and the natural world, which allows people to demonstrate a respect for the natural world and a connection with it. As you know, the weather in the North Atlantic is particularly challenging for much of the year. Very short days now. I was talking to a friend at the other day in Faroe Islands, and she was telling me it was still dark at 9:30 in the morning and it was getting dark at 3:30. So they're farmers, so they're having to compress all that work into a few hours. But in spite of the challenging weather and the very high winds and the storms, people, or because of that challenging weather, people keep an eye on what's going on outside. They don't live in this inside environment, totally, centrally heated and not really caring what the weather's doing, which I know you're in Spain, I'm in England. We have very mild weather. Very rarely snows in the south of England. And a storm is a very unusual occurrence, and it certainly doesn't stop us doing anything. So I think that connection with the elements is something that struck a very deep chord with me.
Yeah, I call it to become too domesticated. We're actually, you talk about the turtles, or you talk about the animals and the natural world, the trees or the mountains or the weather. I mean, that's what we are. We are nature. And then we move inside these boxes, as you say, with our central heating, and we just turn the central heating up, and we just become totally domesticated, and many of us become depressed.
Yes, absolutely. And I think another thing which surprises me in the world today is how many people don't realize that even on a grey looking dark day in the winter, if you go outside, it's actually a lot lighter than you think it is from inside. And it really changes your very deeply felt feelings. So many explorers have written this over the centuries, but, one of the best cures for depression is walking.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, fresh air has always been prescribed for depression, even before we had modern medicines, right? One thing that you do write about is that you say that we dream of islands to be able to run away. That's what you say in your book. So I'm kind of curious what you mean by that. Run away from what and to what? I mean, I know it's just imagined in our heads, but islands do have that.
I think my wife says this is a very male thing. She says that men think they would like to run away to an island where they can have their own little kingdom and where they think they can control the world and keep the outside world away. So all the things that annoy them about their society will be solved by going to a small place where there'll be a king. And of course, as you know, coming from an island culture, it's not that simple. Many people born and bred in the islands dream and fight to leave.
Absolutely.
But I think that for me, there is always something special about an island. It is that idea that you think, whether it's true or not, you think that this is a self-contained sort of bubble and that you can make your own rules there. And I certainly saw that in the tropics. There were a lot of, obviously, Europeans who saw the white sand beaches and the weather that you didn't need to worry about what you were wearing, and a very sort of carefree attitude, it seemed, on the part of the islanders themselves, that this was, as you say, the cliche paradise. But I'm always remembered of a rather silly rom-com film called 6 Days, 7 Nights, starring Harrison Ford. And he plays a rather grizzled old pilot who is flying a little plane between these islands, which I think are loosely based on Polynesia. And he has to ferry a honeymoon couple to their island. And for one reason and another, he ends up alone on the island with the woman, the fiancée. And of course, they fall in love. But he says, it's an island. If you didn't bring it here, you won't find it here. And I think that's the shock that a lot of people find when they actually try and move to an island, that whatever internal problems they've got are probably going to surface and actually possibly be much harder to deal with in a small community and in an isolated place. So I think it's a question, for me, it's probably a question of maturity. I now realize that I have to have an internal peace to live anywhere. Yeah. And it's not that living on the island gives it to me, but it's where I can express it.
Yeah, one of the founders of meditation and mindfulness in the West. His name is John Kabat-Zinn, and he says, wherever you go, there you are. You know, you're still you, and if you have unrest on the inside, it's still gonna come to the surface wherever you go. So then you run away, or you ran to the Faroe Islands. Did you immediately get, I suppose you kind of explained that first it was the nature, and then you became interested in the culture there. And in the book you note that others describe the Faroes as harsh, barren, stark, and bleak, whereas you, on the other hand, find immeasurable beauty there. You find comfort in the basalt, in the rocks, and comfort in the darkness. That's what you write. So can you tell us more about that?
I suppose, I mean, it's a very deeply complex sensation I have, but to take up what we were talking about a second ago, the one very deep sensation I felt almost immediately on arriving in Faroes was a sense of calm. And that was partly to do with the familiarity with the weather and landscape, because I grew up in Ireland, and there are many similarities with not just the culture, but the way the land looks. My grandparents lived in a small village by the seaside, but right behind the town were these mountains, the highest mountains in Northern Ireland. And they look exactly like the Faroes, because they're old and they're rounded. There are no trees once you get above a couple of 100 meters, lots of sheep, lots of ravens. And the weather, being Ireland and being on the coast, very changeable. Not as severe and extreme as in Faroe Islands, but still a day when you're not prepared for rain is unusual. So I think I found I felt at home very quickly, and there was something about that constant wind, or almost constant wind, the changeable skies. And although, yes, you're quite far into the Northern Hemisphere, and there is a shortness of daylight in the winter, as you will know better than me, that northern light is a very subtle thing. It changes. It's almost impossible to describe. It's something to do with the low angle, I guess, of the sun for much of the year. But it is a very tranquilizing light, I think, and a very inspirational light, which I think is why so many Faroese people are interested in the creative arts. There are so many painters, so many writers, you know, for such a tiny population, a remarkable number of people who are musical, who are artistic, who write. And the other similarity I found with the Irish culture was that, unlike, I think I can say, in England, even if someone is not formally educated, say to university level, and they may be they may be a farmer, they may be a plumber, they may be a mechanic, a manual trade. Those people are still willing to talk about ideas. And I think they are not shy of talking about ideas when, you know, once they feel they can trust you. And I found that aspect of the culture very liberating and exciting.
Oh, how interesting. Yeah. I hadn't thought about that. Another thing that really intrigued me is that several places in the book you talk about the darkness. For example, you describe Stóradoimon, it's the island that I see from my house in the Faroe Islands. You describe it as one of those pools of darkness in which sensations are magnified. And then you bring in Wittgenstein to elaborate further, and you say that this lack of light fosters deep thought, but actually not provoking negative emotion. So can you tell us a bit about this comfort, or what it is that you find in this darkness? Is it maybe what you said before about the calmness of that light?
I think so. And I think it's also about that immersion in being at the mercy of the way that the seasons change. Stóradoimon, as you know, quite a small island really by anybody's standards, and inhabited by a very wonderful Faroese family who've been farming that island for 8 generations, which in itself is incredible. And the idea, of course, I can't hijack it. I quote Wittgenstein because he was writing about when he was threshing out some of his deepest philosophical ideas. He found he had to go to somewhere that was remote and small and quiet. And he went to the west of Ireland, actually to Galway, to a very tiny settlement by the sea. And he wrote to a colleague back in Oxford saying that here was somewhere that was very hard to find even then, somewhere where there wasn't a lot of artificial light. And when it got dark, it really got dark. And I think that's that's something I identified with immediately when I read it, because I lived in Ireland, even at university, I lived in a very small hamlet by the sea, which had no street lighting. And I was studying before anthropology, Irish literature. And I spent a lot of time reading the works of people like J.M. Singh, who wrote about rural Ireland. And of course, that world that he was writing about has all but disappeared. But it was a world where people were afraid to go out at night because they thought there were spirits in the mountains. There were creatures that could appear and kidnap you. There were also, potentially criminals out there who could knock you over the head and steal your money. And I think, as we were talking earlier, that idea of living in these electrically lit, centrally heated bubbles. Again, we have a very safe and very secure modern life, but it's very internal. And although in those days they were huddling around the coal fire or the peat fire, and they were afraid of going out, when they did go out, they were really immersed in that darkness. And I think it's something that's quite damaging to the human spirit not to experience that now. And I think I immediately warmed in the Faroe Islands to the idea of the Hulda folk, the Hulda men, who again are these, not exactly goblins or trolls, but these human-like creatures that inhabited the mountains. And I was so profoundly affected when I heard that many older Faroese people felt that we no longer see them because we have too many electric lights.
Yeah.
And I think that's not just a folk tale. That tells you, something very deeply about our connection with being out in the world at night, which is something very primeval, actually, which modern people are increasingly never experience.
Yeah, I can't. Well, there's two things. One thing that came up for me when you were talking about how you before, in the old days, before there were streetlights, you were afraid of going out in the dark because there might be huldefolk, there might be other beings out there. But now all that fear is still there, but it's fear of inner demons, People have so many inner demons. And I think it must be a lot more healthy for us to have that fear in the natural world than this internalized fear that most modern human beings feel today, because fear has to be there. So it's a human feeling, but it's much more healthy to have, that fear of the unknown outside in the darkness than this inner fear that we're consumed by in these domesticated lives. And then another thing, my father has land in the Faroes and he has a lot of sheep. And the man that used to help my father with the sheep when I was young, when I was a child, and all my childhood, his name was Erling. He has died now. He communicated with the Huldefolk, those unseen beings that live in the big rocks, every day. And he was like, of course they're here. I mean, and he told the stories, and we would sit there with big ears listening. And it for him it was absolutely true. No doubt about it.
I used to always play outside when I was at secondary school. We had a nice house with a very big garden, and I was always out there in the garden and playing with the dog or just playing by myself. And but when it got dark, I would often run into the house, and my parents would laugh at me and say, "What are you running away from?" And I would say, "Oh, I thought there was something out there. I had this sense that there was something out there." Yeah. And my father used to laugh and not make fun of me, but he could see that I felt it very deeply, that there was, you sometimes sense things in the dark, which of course the modern way of thinking would be to say, you're imagining it. But I'm not sure that we always are. I think, there are people who are sensitive to spirits or, the otherworldliness of being out in the dark, as you say. Perhaps it's just a remnant of our caveman past, but again, I think it's something that until very recently, and as you say, perhaps even in some people in the Faroe Islands, is part of their reality, and it's dangerous to just dismiss it as a folk tale, because it does symbolize and represent something about our relationship with all kinds of things in nature.
Yeah, and I mean, Aldous Huxley said that our brain, the human brain, is just a reduction valve. What we see, I mean, other animals see other colors and other shapes that we can't see with our human eyes, and other animals hear and sense magnetic waves that we can't. So we don't see the whole spectrum of reality. We see 5% or something, so who knows? And so this brings me to throughout your book, you visit a raven's nest. And from the moment that they are just eggs and until they are big enough to take off and fly. And you further say that the spot by the ravens feels like a sacred spot to you, and the birds convey magic. That's what you say in the book. And then you also, in that same, you say that the Celts, or the Celtic people, they call these places thin places, where the afterlife and this life touch. So here we're talking about sacredness in the birds, and we're talking about magic and this thin whale, no? So what can you tell us about that? The sacredness in nature and the magic in nature.
Yes, I think, as you know, the raven, especially in Nordic culture, but not just in Nordic culture, certainly in Native American culture, in the northern latitudes, has always been seen as a messenger bird, as a bird that can find out what's going on in the world and somehow transmit it to certain lucky people. Very famously in Icelandic myths, the story of Hugin and Munin, the two ravens who tell Odin what's going on in the world. And they're not just messengers; they are also, one of them is sort of, we would call it in English, its name really means mind or thought, and they convey a sense of the feeling of the world, not just the physical thing you can obviously see. So I suppose I can't account for why I responded quite so strongly to the ravens. As a naturalist, I felt very lucky to have found a spot where I could get close to the nest and look down on it without disturbing the birds. Normally ravens are up high and you only see them flying in and out, and it's quite difficult to watch what's going in the nest. And the idea that I could lie there on the cliff for hours at a time watching them with nobody else around, I became obsessed with the progress of the chicks, and I got increasingly anxious as they got bigger that something might happen to them, or that I wouldn't see them fly before I had to leave the island. And of course I had time then to think about the symbolism of this bird, and being alone with nobody for miles around, just me and the birds and the sea and whatever else was happening in the grass and on the rocks. Again, as we talked about, it's very liberating to your psyche and to your psychology, and you start thinking about things that we simply don't have the time to think about in our, electrically lit, warm world. So I think it was a very strong combination of things. As a bird watcher, I felt privileged. There was something about that lonely cry of the raven and this northern landscape and this changeable weather, and it just all seemed to mix together perfectly, I suppose.
Yeah. And so reading your book, although you are writing about the Faroes, you also share, you share your feelings and so on as you are writing the book. So it also brings forth a picture of you as a person, of who you are. And I could really sense this almost, maybe it's just me, but I seem to sense this almost tangible feeling of longing in you. A longing for something that the Faroe Islands and its culture somehow have. So am I completely wrong, or is there a longing for something that you can still feel in the Faroe Islands?
As I mentioned earlier, I can't really explain it 100% on a rational, practical level. I know that I felt at home there very quickly. I know that I felt accepted by Faroese people very quickly. And of course, Faroese people are famously friendly to outsiders, but I'm talking about getting to a deeper level where people accept you not just as a curious outsider that they want to talk to because you're a novelty initially, but because I like to think they saw in me somebody who understood the way they thought about the world or think about the world, and had similar values perhaps in terms of the relationships we make and how we talk to people and the things we care about. I can only say that being there, I feel liberated psychologically, and that is about being comfortable in the landscape, but being also challenged by the landscape, but feeling very, very privileged that here is a place where I have genuine friends who are extremely hospitable, who go out of their way to welcome me when I visit and allow me to stay with them in their homes, but also take me out to collect the sheep in the autumn, or to hunt birds, or whatever it is they're doing. And I like to think they wouldn't do that unless they felt very comfortable with me. So I suppose you only feel comfortable with someone that you feel, has a similar attitude to the world. And for some reason, all of those factors have come together for me. Because of the current pandemic, like everybody, I've been unable to return. Even when it was technically possible to do so, I didn't feel it was responsible to go to a small community from outside, not because I felt I was a health risk, because I obviously wouldn't have traveled if I thought I was contagious, but I felt it wasn't right to expect people to be hospitable to me as an outsider in the current situation. I felt that Faroese people probably would welcome me in, but I didn't want to give that responsibility to them. Yeah. So I miss the place desperately. For the last number of years, I've been going 3 or 4 times a year, sometimes for up to 6 weeks at a time. And I think about Faroe Islands every day. So although I'm living in England, half of my brain is always there. And I consider myself so lucky to live at a time when the technology allows you to talk to people free, without it costing you money, and to keep in touch with other people's lives, a long way away. And so I live in this divided mental state where a lot of me is thinking about the Faroe Islands, literally every day.
Yeah, I that's the sense I got from your book, that it seems to me like there's that belonging feeling, that you feel that belonging in the Faroes, and that it has something to do with that, the sense I got that the Faroes are extremely grounded.
Yes,
because
yes.
what you describe is you describe the traditional life in the Faroes, as you say, it's a very modern society, but all those traditional things of killing your own food is still very much part of nature.
Yes, and I think what you've said is very important. It's that idea of being grounded, and I don't want to stray into controversial territory here, but I think one of the things I feel very strongly is that community is very important to Faroese people. Family is very important.
Yeah.
Knowing whose grandmother was your grandmother, which island she came from, all those kinds of things. And although Faroese people are very modern and travel extremely widely, often working abroad, they have a very grounded attitude to all kinds of things. A lot of the things that we spend our lives getting very worked up about, political things, societal themes and memes, things that really get us very agitated. Faroese people know about those things, but they don't let them in to such an extent where they're unhappy about the world, I suppose. And I don't know whether that's the Viking heritage, the strength of character, or whether it's just the benefit of coming from a small, tight-knit community, which I know can be suffocating even for Faroese people at times, or for certain people. But there is just this sort of peace I feel there, this sense that people are concerned with the important things in life, and they're not overly materialistic, although that's changing a little bit. But they don't talk about money. They're not very interested in getting a bigger car, or there are no districts which are known as where the rich people live. It's a very equitable society. And I like to think that even the younger generation of Faroese people I hope they value that. I hope that, as I always say to my Faroese friends, I hope you understand how rich you are.
Yeah, but as you also saw in the Faroe Islands, the young people are very interested in all those things. You know, my brother is, I'm 45, so my brother is 43, he lives there. I mean, that's his passion, that whole, the birds, the potatoes, the sheep, all that traditional life, the boats and the fishing and all that. I mean,
and I think, as you will know better than I, although you're an exception, I think in this case, that so many Faroese women, particularly, who do, in general, better at school than the boys quite often, as in most societies, they often go to Denmark or to another country for higher education. But as soon as they meet a husband or boyfriend and they start to think about a family, they very, very often want to take those children back to grow up in Faroese society with those values, and to know, you know, where they come from and to appreciate that way of life. And I think, as you say, even, you know, people in their 20s are making that decision. Mostly they do realize that actually the big bright world of the big city in Europe is not necessarily the place to find happiness.
Yeah, this brings me to, also because we have 10 minutes or so left, that your book is called The Land of Maybe, and then you the word is kanska in Faroese, and you say that kanska, the word maybe, acknowledges that nothing can be guaranteed on an island or in life. It's like an acceptance that human plans may be displaced by a greater power, which in the Faroe Islands is often the weather and just the nature. And I can't help thinking that that also gives you a lot of resilience, that you can't really make a lot of plans. You can't control life because the elements, the nature is much bigger than you are. So maybe that is also part of what gives you that psychological resilience of not getting too caught up in trying to control things. What do you think?
Yes, and not worrying about things that don't really matter. You know, I think Faroese people have a deeply, you could call it humanist or Christian tradition. Both result in the same way of treating other people with respect. I'd be very strongly struck by the way Faroese people, of course they do gossip occasionally, but actually it's not, people are very reluctant to say something bad about another person, in my experience. If you don't like somebody in Faroe Islands, you just avoid them. And that to me seems a much healthier way of dealing with difficult human relationships. So yes, I think it's that sense of only getting really worked up about the things that really matter. But centuries of knowing that, you know, as I quote in the book, an earlier writer saying that even if someone were to say we're getting married on Saturday, you don't know if it would have actually taken place, because there might have been a storm and you couldn't row the priest over to conduct the ceremony, or whatever it is. And I found that quite unsettling initially in Faroes, that I would say to somebody who I thought I was friendly with, are we going for that walk on Saturday? And they would never say absolutely. They would say, oh, I think so. And for me, that was a sense of, do they really want to go, or are they putting me off in a? But of course, it was just that Faroese way of, yes, that's our plan, but who knows if something may crop up that will stop us. And I've got used to that now. I think I can interpret when somebody's trying to get rid of me and when they're actually just not wanting to commit, because we never know.
Yeah, and it is very real. You know, the weather in the Faroes is very real. You cannot go in the mountains if the weather is not good. So this podcast is called Intimacy with the World. What does that phrase invoke or convey in you?
Gosh,
I mean, you've been all over the world.
Yes, and as you alluded at the beginning of our conversation, you have a background in anthropology. I have a background in anthropology. I think the thing that anthropology teaches you, if nothing else, is that there is nothing strange about the way people react with the world or interact with the world. You know, an anthropologist understands that just because people in a tribal society dance around in a circle and stick a bone through their nose or their ear, that doesn't make them odd. If you can understand the way they see the world, then everything they do makes sense. And I think it teaches you to be respectful of all other cultures and realize that if you can get at the knowledge that people have in their heads about the physical world around them, you can understand pretty much everything they believe. So I suppose for me, intimacy with the world would be about acceptance and always looking to see what it is about that particular society or culture that makes them do things in that particular way. Some things are forced upon societies by the weather, by the part of the world they live in, by the food that's available to them. And again, to come back to the Faroe Islands, that level of intimacy with the world of the Faroe Islands has very much revolved around the birds and the sea and the mountains. And we haven't mentioned, of course, the sheep, which are, of course, other creatures which in many societies people would regard as a rather stupid animal, an animal that doesn't do much except eat grass. But of course, when you start to understand the cycle of the sheep year and how that brings the community together by having to go up into the mountains to round the sheep up, actually quite dangerous work even today in many places. You know, that is a part of the Faroese world which has affected the Faroese psyche and mentality. I always thought sheep were rather uninteresting. I live in the country. We have many sheep a few hundred meters from my house, and I didn't really take much notice of them. But having now spent so much time in the Faroe Islands, I find sheep absolutely fascinating.
Adorable. But you must admit that the Faroese sheep are actually exceptionally beautiful.
Well, they are. Of course they are. They're the most beautiful sheep in the world.
Thank you.
But I have a question for you, Durita, and I know you don't live in the Faroe Islands all the time, but what did you feel reading the book as a Faroese woman? Here's this cheeky foreigner trying to convey a sense of your island and your special culture. Most Faroese people have actually been very fascinated by the idea that an outsider should take such an interest. I hope I've done your islands justice. I hope I've captured something which you recognize.
I enjoyed it so much, and I am someone who didn't grow up in Tórshavn. I grew up in everything you say. I grew up in the boats, I grew up in fishing, I grew up with the whales. Okay, we killed whales in the Faroes. I grew up with the sheep and all that. And I didn't know that you were an anthropologist when I read the book. Not that it matters, but I kept thinking, wow, this is so interesting. This is just like an outsider seeing the Faroe Islands with that outsider's view, but really participating in the real life, not just watching it, you know, participant observation. And I could just recognize everything. And just also the character of the people, because you don't describe how the people are, but it just comes forth, the sense of the people. And when I read the whole book, and I liked that I read it in about 10 days or so, because it's better to immerse yourself in it. It was just a sense. It wasn't like what you said so and so about the sheep. I knew all that stuff, but I just had this deep sense of, here's someone who understands the spirit of the Faroe Islands, the spirit of the land and the spirit of the people, because I've always seen those things as intertwined, of course, but like different things at the same time, like each has its own spirit. And I just really sat with this sense of, wow, I've just been back to the Faroes, both to the landscapes, to that spirit of the landscape, and to the spirit of the culture. So I immensely enjoyed it, and I found it extremely accurate. And there was nothing where I thought, well, I don't know about that. You know, I felt that it was very, very accurate. So I really congratulate you.
Well, that's very kind of you to say so. I mean, I'm very pleased that you felt that way, because my big fear writing the book was, do I get something wrong? And I know there are grammatical mistakes when I write a Faroese word, or I've got a place mixed up with somewhere else. I'm working on correcting all those things in the second edition, but they're pretty small things. But my big fear writing it was that my Faroese friends and Faroese people who I don't know personally, although I don't think there were so many of those left now, but that they would read this and say, who is this Englishman? What does he know about our country? You know, and I really didn't want to be the kind of travel writer who goes somewhere for a short period and just describes the things which strike them as odd or strange or amusing about another place, because I don't think that's ultimately very respectful. And I really wanted Faroese people to say, this is a valuable snapshot of ways of life which inevitably are changing or are in some senses diminishing. As you say, more people living in the capital and becoming a little bit distant. Although the nice thing is that even the doctor and the lawyer and the businessman still goes out to collect his sheep in the autumn, and that's very valuable. So I'm very pleased that you thought I'd captured that aim, and I didn't know if I could do it, and I did feel very anxious as an outsider, and not speaking Faroese fluently. I learn a little bit more each time, of course, and that's my dream one day, is to be able to speak Faroese properly. But it's not an easy language.
No, it's not.
But you know,
I just wanted to tell you an interesting observation. Do you know this book by Robin Wall? I know that you have to go. Do you know this book by Robin Wall Kimmerer called Braiding Sweetgrass?
Yes, I do know the book. Yeah.
Yeah. So she has Indian, like the American Indians heritage. Her grandfather was, and so she talks about language. She's also trying to learn the language of her ancestors, so she talks about how a river is a person, like it is in the Indian culture, or the sea is a living being, not a person, but a living being. It has life. It's not.
And we're all connected.
Yes, exactly. And so she talks about how in English a tree is it. It doesn't even have gender, and how many things are, everything except humans are it. And that happens in Norwegian and in Danish too, but not in Faroese. It's still he and she. A plant is a she.
Yes.
And the moon and the sun are all gendered. They're not in Danish and Norwegian. They would have been in the olden days, but it's still alive in the Faroes. So Faroese language obviously still has some of that life-giving.
No, that's very interesting. I'm just stopping my phone from making a noise. No, that is very interesting, because of course, as you know, as an anthropologist, that language is the idiosyncrasies of languages from different parts of the world. They do very much connect with people's emotional connection to the planet, and to the world around them. And yes, I think, yes, I'm not a linguistic historian, but I think even though we don't gender our nouns, and thank goodness, because it makes English a lot easier in some ways, I think we find other ways of expressing our respect for the natural world. But that is an interesting aspect of Faroese. And again, that deep historical lineage, you know, going back to so much of modern Faroese is still unchanged from Old Norse. And I went to the cinema a little while ago and saw an Icelandic film. And I was amazed watching it, how much Icelandic I could understand, because of course so many words are virtually the same as Faroese. So that was an added bonus. I didn't realize that I can almost speak Icelandic now.
You can learn, you can have two in one.
Yes, exactly.
So I am very aware of your time, Tim. I really hope that I get to meet you in person sometime in the Faroe Islands.
Absolutely. Well, it's been very nice talking to you, Durita, and it's extremely gratifying to talk to somebody who's read the book so carefully and responded to the not so obvious aspects of what I was trying to get out with the writing. And you know, it's extremely nice to know that as a Faroese woman, you've seen your own country represented, as you say, fairly, at least I hope. And that was really my biggest ambition with the book. And I hope that it not necessarily makes people want to visit the Faroe Islands, but makes people understand the Faroese way.
Yes.
And that would be what I would want people to take away from the book, and also to remind ourselves that there are still societies, although they have all the modern inventions and luxuries, have not lost that connection to the natural world, and have not forgotten that actually we're an animal ourselves, and we're subject to natural forces, and we forget that at our peril, just not only physically but also psychologically. Yes. And it's that sense of belonging, which I'm envious of the Faroese people, and I just feel very, very privileged that I've been able to experience a bit of that and to immerse myself in it when I do go back to Faroes. And as I say, the greatest privilege has been making Faroese friends who, I've never been anywhere in the world. You mentioned, I've worked all over the world, very few places I haven't been. As a journalist, of course, you are right at the heart of things sometimes which are happening, very important things. So you're not just there as a tourist. But I have never anywhere in the world been welcomed in the way I have been by Faroese friends, and that is nothing but a privilege.
I think it's very reciprocal, like your gratitude to the Faroes, as you say, from what you have learned there, the belonging, the grounding, and the culture, and how people have welcomed you. But I think it's very reciprocal, because your outsider's view of the Faroes, an outsider sees something else. So you've given us an immense gift, a real deep gift with your book, because you allow us to see ourselves with your book. But it's a very respectful view, and it's someone who has really participated and immersed themselves in our culture. And it's such a gift. It was like coming back home. It's reciprocal. I love that.
Well, what's the Faroese phrase? Glupt just since aya.
I think you have to work a little bit more on your Faroese.
Of course I do, yes. But you understand the sense of what I was trying to say.
So Tim, thank you so much. This takes me 10 seconds just to end off here. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I really hope that everybody that was here listening with us, that you enjoyed this episode with Tim Ecott, journalist and author of several books. His latest one, Maybe, The Land of Maybe. And thank you so much for listening to Intimacy with the World podcast with me, Dorita Holm. And please be sure to subscribe to the podcast and leave a comment. And if you were with us on YouTube, please like the video and leave a comment. This greatly helps other interested people find these inspiring conversations, and it also helps me. So thank you so much again, and see you all next week.